Welcome to Echoes of History, a Ubisoft podcast brought to you by History Hit. This is the place to explore the rich stories from the past that bring the world of Assassin's Creed to life. I'm Matt Lewis. In case you haven't had the chance to see it yet, the world premiere trailer for Assassin's Creed Shadows was released, and you can see that it takes place in feudal Japan. This is a time famous for its samurai and ninjas, an era rich in history, culture, and stories. For the next few episodes in this series, we'll be exploring this fascinating period in history. So far, we've travelled back in time to the Sengoku period, sowed the seeds for the unification of Japan, and seen cultures collide with the arrival of Portuguese missionaries on Japanese shores. Today, we're tracing the story of a key figure in this era of upheaval, Japan's first black samurai, Yasuke. As one of the main two characters in Assassin's Creed Shadows, you'll get to see the world of feudal Japan through the eyes of the legendary African samurai. But how and when did Yasuke end up in Japan? What was his journey to becoming Japan's first black samurai? And what can his story tell us about life in Sengoku, Japan? To find out more about this notorious and yet mysterious figure from Japanese history, I'm joined by Thomas Lockley, Associate Professor at Nihon University in Tokyo, and author of African Samurai, The True Story of Yasuke. Welcome to Echoes of History, Thomas. It's great to have you on.
Thank you very much for having me. It's a true honour to be with you today.
I can't wait to find out more about this incredible figure who is a playable character in Assassin's Creed Shadows. I think our audience would like to know as much about him as they possibly can too. So to start off with, can you tell us a little bit about Yasuke's life, or what we do or don't know about him before he arrives in Japan? Where does he come from?
Well, we know that he's from Africa, but we don't know for certain which part of Africa, apart from that it would have been on the East Coast. The descriptions we have from Japanese descriptions are very much of somebody from what is now South Sudan. Very tall, very black, very strong, whereas there's a couple of sources which suggest he might have come from the Mozambique area. However, he doesn't fit the description very much of people from that region. There's also the full possibility that he could have been somehow trafficked from the South Sudan area down south and come through Mozambique as well. And I think possibly that might be what we're looking at.
Okay, so we don't really know too much about his life sort of before he appears in Japan.
We don't know about his exact life. We can work back with research to the life of people like him. The majority of people like him were mercenaries in India, having been trafficked from Africa for the express purpose of becoming soldiers. Highly likely that if he came from the northeast Sudan area, that he was employed as a soldier in India and then employed as a bodyguard when the Jesuits were coming further east to Japan, which is in the middle of a century of war already. Jesuits can't carry swords or weapons, but they can employ people that do. And Yasuke was a perfect employee in that sense, a bodyguard.
Interesting. So we can sort of surmise that he may well have been trafficked, that he's likely to have been in India, and that he's likely to have some sort of a military background, some sort of military training by the time he arrives in Japan too. So then how and when does he arrive in Japan? What do we know about him coming to Japanese shores?
Well, he arrived in May 1579 on a ship from Macau. To get from Africa, whichever part of Africa it was, to Macau and then to Japan, he'd already spent time in India. He'd spent time in Malacca, in modern-day Malaysia, and I think it was about 6 to 9 months in Macau. They're waiting for the winds to go. He was the bodyguard of a Jesuit, the head Jesuit in Asia, essentially the head of the Christian church in Asia, a man called Alessandro Valiano. And Valiano was on a tour from Rome. He'd been sent by the Pope to tour the new missions in Asia, and of course Japan was the furthest of these missions. So it was the last place that he eventually got to.
Interesting. So he's coming as part of a Jesuit mission. Could he have been Christian? Do we have any idea of his religious background at this point?
But it's highly likely that he would have been Christian, at least on paper. I don't think the Jesuits would have employed him necessarily if he hadn't. And in any respect at this time, let's just say conversion was enforced often I mean, he would have been taken as a kid, and therefore, I mean, he's probably not got a lot to say in exactly the circumstances of his early life. It's only when we get to his adulthood, when he gets to Japan, that he actually has some agency, as far as we can tell.
Interesting that the agency comes with arriving in Japan. Hopefully we can come back to that a little bit later. What do we know about how the Japanese react to Yasuke's appearance on Japanese shores? Would he have been perhaps the first African they might have encountered?
Well, you've got to remember, Japan, one, is a big country, even today. And the people that would have encountered him first on the west coast in Kyushu, what is the modern island of Kyushu, would not have been the same, even in vague contact, really, with the sender. There was no newspapers, there was no television, there was no podcasts in those days. So the people in the West will have seen many Africans in their ports, through Chinese ships, through Portuguese ships. Therefore, he wouldn't have been such a big thing there. I mean, what the Japanese sources say about him is that he stood out for his size, not necessarily for the fact that he's African, although, of course, the fact that he's black and very different is very, very important, but it's his size. He would have been considered a very big man today. In those days, he was considered a giant, about 6'2" to 6'4" in imperial measurements, which is about 178 centimeters, I believe. He was a big guy, and the average Japanese person was around 150 centimeters at the time, and that's probably an optimistic average. So he would have been literally more than a head above everybody else.
Yeah, standing head and shoulders above everyone else.
With big shoulders as well.
Yeah, he must have been quite a striking figure for them to see for a variety of reasons then. What do we know about how he might have begun to communicate with Japanese people? Presumably he arrives, like a lot of the Jesuits, with a big language barrier.
Probably not, actually. The Jesuits were big linguists, and many of them were trained beforehand to be able to speak the languages of the people they were trying to convert. Yasuke is recorded 2 years afterwards as having quite a good level of Japanese. I mean, of course, he could have started to learn it when he arrived 2 years before, but Valiano himself, the visitor, the chief inspector of churches, if you like, was a big proponent of learning any language. He started the concept of Asian studies. Asian language studies in Europe was started by him. He was the person who insisted that his missionaries study Chinese, Japanese, various Indian languages. So it's conceivable that Yasuke had already started to learn Japanese before he arrived.
And I guess the big question is, how on earth does this guy who arrives as a Jesuit bodyguard from Africa via India end up being a Japanese samurai?
Well, when I said that in the West, they were probably quite used to Africans, apart from the size of this particular man, Yasuke, when he got to the center of the country, the capital area, what is now near Kyoto or Osaka, they probably had never seen an African before. He was swamped, literally swamped. There's several records of him being mobbed by crowds trying to touch him, see him. Houses fell down because they were getting on top of the houses to get a look at him. In one of the processions in a place called Sakai, basically the procession of people was broken up, it was destroyed, and he had to get on a horse to escape. And one can imagine that there was some muscles got in to push people out of the way. Another one, when getting to Miyako, which is now Kyoto, a huge mob literally surrounded the mission and almost pushed the mission down, throwing stones. There were dead people in the crowd outside. And at that point, Nobunaga, who was the most powerful warlord in Japan at the time, was 5 minutes walk away. He heard this huge hullabaloo, if you like. He heard what was going on, and he demanded to see who was disturbing the peace, demanded that this person be brought before him, and hence the date with destiny, if you like. Yasuke is brought to the most powerful man and probably the most infamous man in the whole of Japanese history. It's not just that he was powerful then. This is a man who, you go into any bookshop in Japan, there will be a book about him, even today. It's very difficult to say just how much of a famous figure he is. He's something like a Napoleon or a Winston Churchill in the European sense. They hit it off, bizarrely, perhaps. But also, Nobunaga was a man that thought out of the box. He thought differently. He was the first proponent of mass guns, supposedly invented the mass volley, which Europeans later on copied and put to good use all around the world. He also was very, very keen on dressing up in strange clothes, Chinese clothes, barbarian clothes, meaning Portuguese clothes, etc., etc. And there's lots of records of that. So the fact that he would have employed an African is not actually that strange. He did have Chinese employees, and he specifically, although he couldn't employ Jesuits, specifically kept Jesuits near him for fun, to talk about things like maps and globes and building works and things like that, which the Jesuits were very well educated for Europeans in this area, were very good at doing. And therefore, I don't think it's that strange that Yasuke came before him. They hit it off, they talked in Japanese, and eventually, though sadly we don't know the details, I would love to know those details. Somehow, within a few days, Yasuke has entered Nobunaga's service. Within a month, he's gone to Nobunaga's castle town. There's another Jesuit record from there, and there's a Japanese record from there as well that says how much Nobunaga enjoyed talking to him, that he gave him a house, that he gave him a sword. And that's where the idea that he became a samurai comes into it. The idea being if you give somebody a sword, they are in your service, and it's a traditional mark of a samurai. What a samurai was at this point in history is up for debate. And therefore, it's impossible to say 100% what it was that Nobunaga was doing for Yasuke. But what we can definitely say is that he became one of Nobunaga's very close circle, literally within the very close 30 people around him, mostly much younger men, teenage mostly. Nobunaga was very fond of teenage men. And Yasuke became one of these close courtiers, if you like.
It's an incredible story for him to arrive there, undergo all of that kind of swamping by people, the reaction to him. But it seems like perhaps it was well timed in that Nobunaga is a man who likes innovation. He likes new things. He likes, engaging with different new ideas, and that perhaps this arrival precisely works for him. Here is something new, something that he can engage with. And, a particularly huge guy with some martial experience who you can add to your circle to make you look good.
I'm pretty sure that would have been a massive, massive bonus for him. There's one wonderful picture of Yasuke sumo wrestling with 10 other guys. I can say with 99% surety that it is the only true depiction that we have of Yasuke. We know that it's him. There are many others of Africans at the time. Hundreds, literally, of Africans in Japan at the time. But we can't say with any certainty that they are Yasuke. The beautiful one of him sumo wrestling, and then there's another 10 men waiting their turn, is Yasuke. And that, I think, is what Nobunaga would have seen. He had somebody in his crowd who was not only useful militarily, as you said, but also is entertaining. And there's a specific record that says Yasuke was entertaining for Nobunaga. Not an entertaining in a funny ha-ha like a jester type of way, like you're stupid, but the kind of entertaining and stimulating entertainment, like your podcast.
Yeah, wonderful, thank you. So he's good company for Nobunaga.
Perfect word, he's good company. In my book, African Samurai, we look into how Yasuke might have felt about this. That's not necessarily in any documented place, but we do look at how this would have fit in the dynamics of it, if you like.
What do you think Yasuke would have made of all of that reaction to him? You've just said we don't really have it documented, but having studied him so much, what do you think he would have made of all of this fuss about him?
Well, he became a rich man very quickly in a time where that would have meant an awful lot. He went from being a probably fairly lowly employee or enslaved to being quite literally one of the highest in the land, or at least with access to the very highest in the land next door, if you like. That would have been a big thing for a 26-year-old. It would be a big thing for a 26-year-old today. And I think it would have been an even bigger thing in those days. There's another record of their first audience where Nobunaga gifts him what is essentially 30 kilos of coins. And you can imagine that as a kind of joke as well. Give the strong man 30 kilos worth of money and see if he can actually carry it. It doesn't say whether he carried it away on his own or not, but that was a lot of money. A lot of money.
You'd have given it a good go for 30 kilos worth of coins. I'd have given it a good go to drag that away.
I think he would have been expected to pick it up. You couldn't drag it.
I'd still give it a go. It's a lot of money.
It is a lot of money.
Do we know whether Yasuke undergoes any kind of formal samurai training? So he's often remembered as a samurai. As you mentioned, we don't really know what that means at this time. Does he undergo any kind of training in using a Japanese sword, or is it literally the case that Nobunaga gives him a sword and then we count him as a samurai?
Well, the romantic in me would like to say yes. Of course, he had training. The historian in me says probably not. The nearest we can get to any evidence is that picture of sumo wrestling. Sumo wrestling is a martial art. It's a preparation for war, for warriors. And that is some evidence that he's certainly engaged within martial pursuits, shall we say. But beyond that, it's impossible to say.
What does Yasuke's story tell us about medieval Japanese society and about their view of foreigners? I think we quite often have this idea that Japan was quite a closed society and culture for large periods of time, but it seems like they're quite welcoming during this period.
I would say so, partly because at this period, Japan was in the midst of the civil war and people were coming from the outside all the time, and they were bringing in all sorts of useful things, technologies to mine silver, which then would be processed into weapons. These are all Chinese technologies, by the way. Technology for making castles, technologies for increased food supply so you can feed more soldiers. And then the Europeans come in with these fancy boats and these fancy guns. The Japanese immediately copy these guns and start manufacturing on a massive scale, to the extent that there is a belief that there were more guns in Japan by the end of that century than the whole of the world put together. You can time it to about a 50-year period where so many guns were made that it eclipses all the guns in the rest of the world. People have had this idea of disconnection or xenophobia, perhaps. You've also got this country that is doing more to introduce foreign ideas for their own use than probably any other country in the world at the time. So there is a disconnect there. And I'm pretty certain that Yasuke is being part of this new wave of new blood, if you like, would have definitely endeared him to the people around him. And the fact that he could speak, in fact, he's obviously a man who had charm and personality, would really, really have made a big difference, I think.
Yeah. His arrival timed well with Nobunaga being there, who was willing to embrace all of this and welcome it. And I guess if we're being slightly cynical, Nobunaga is thinking about what he can get out of all of this new technology and everything else.
That's not cynical at all. That's 100% what he was doing. He was a man who was on a mission to end 100 years of war, partly for his own benefit, but partly also for the people under him. And the people who he ruled over loved him, quite literally, because he brought peace. He brought economic prosperity. He brought all sorts of benefits, which when you're in a bandit-ridden place, pirates on the seashore, bandits coming down from the mountains, Nobunaga was the person to sort all those problems out. But he did it with an iron fist, or with gunpowder and lead. He would have seen all of these as benefits for himself and for his mission.
And in that environment, a 6'4" guy who knows how to fight is another benefit.
And also, there is one thing that I haven't talked about yet, but the Buddha or various deities are often depicted as black-skinned in Japan, even today, but they were even more so in those days, as far as we know. Therefore, this very, very dark, not light brown skin, but very dark skin, he's described as having skin the color of ink, black ink, is for many people might almost seem godly or divine in some respect. So Nobunaga would have been in a position of having this divine giant behind him as his bodyguard or as one of his closest circles. I mean, that's one interpretation of it. We can't say that for definite, but it is an interpretation. And of course, that would have made Nobunaga look even more godly than he did before.
Absolutely. I mean, another reason why Yasuke would have stood out, but another reason that Nobunaga would have been keen to draw him near and associate himself with this guy who represents so much.
Absolutely. No question about it.
Have you ever wondered if the Hanging Gardens of Babylon were actually real? Or what made Alexander so great? Join me, Tristan Hughes, twice a week, every week on the Ancients from History Hit, where I'm joined by leading academics, best-selling authors, and world-class archaeologists to shine a light on some of ancient history's most fascinating questions, like who built Stonehenge and why? What are the Dead Sea Scrolls and why are they so valuable? And were the Spartan warriors really as formidable as the history books say? Join me, Tristan Hughes, twice a week, every week on the Ancients from History Hit, wherever you get your podcasts.
We've talked a little bit about samurai and the lack of clarity around what a samurai really was and what it meant. Does Yasuke's career inform that at all? I think there's this view that samurai were born and trained all their lives in the arts of being a samurai, and yet we have this guy who arrives and sort of within days he's given a sword and termed as a samurai.
2 years. Within several days or a month or so of meeting Nobunaga, but he'd already been in Japan 2 years at the time.
Okay, sorry. But he doesn't have that cultural background as a samurai. Does that inform our understanding of what a samurai was in the late 16th century at all?
It does. Samurai prior to this era of civil war, which is called the era of the warring states, prior to that is what you talked about, the hereditary training from birth, etc. They had been descended from essentially warriors for several hundred years. But during the warring states period, basically there's a lack of manpower. Anybody that can bear a weapon is conscripted or is rounded up and stuck in an army. Therefore, what it meant to be a warrior, what it meant to be a samurai, only a very, very tiny percentage would have been trained from birth in that traditional manner that you're talking about. At this point, we're probably talking most of them being peasant boys that were conscripted or were forced into it or went into it just so they could have something to eat. I mean, this is a time when people are starving everywhere. The armies would have been the best fed people, and there would have been plunder as well, and slaves to take, and there would have been profit in it. So status was a big thing at this point, and it was one of the most open times in Japanese history. You could make your name. Nobunaga's main retainer, a man called Hideyoshi, was born a peasant. He actually became Nobunaga's successor after Nobunaga died. So he rose from literally the bottom, almost, to the top within his lifetime. He died quite early as well, maybe in his 50s. So it wasn't even a long life. He personifies this era in the same way that Yasuke does. Yasuke comes from abroad, but he's got the right skills at the right time and comes in there and offers those skills. Hideyoshi did the same. Many, many tens, hundreds of thousands of others were doing exactly the same at this time.
We talked about Nobunaga a bit more in a previous episode. He really did focus as well on using the foot soldiers much more than lots of his predecessors. He was willing to equip them and treat them better because they would form a core of an army. So are we seeing a bit of a blurring of the lines between the samurai and the soldier in Nobunaga's reign so that someone like Yasuke can come along as a man who knows how to fight and make it into the ranks of a samurai, which he might not have been able to do previously?
You're 100% correct. Those conscripted peasants, if you like, were called ashigaru, and they were distinct from samurai in the traditional sense, but they were still warriors in that they were fighting. 10 years later, after this, when the wars are starting to finish, when everything's kind of heading towards peace, those men and their families find themselves thrown out of that warrior class. The samurai class becomes a caste or a class, again, in a more traditional sense, and puts the walls up to all of the Johnny-come-latelys, if you like. So we don't know what happened to Yasuke at that point. We don't have any concrete records, but it would have been interesting to find out what happened to him at the same time as all the other peasant soldiers were finding that they were no longer needed.
Yeah, so he really does land on a sweet spot in Japanese history for him.
In that context, yeah.
What do we know about what happens to Yasuke then after Nobunaga dies in 1582, given that he is so close personally to Nobunaga and his relationship is with Nobunaga? Do we know what happens to Yasuke after he's gone?
So Yasuke was there at Nobunaga's death. He possibly was the last person to see him alive. Nobunaga was killed in a coup d'etat, essentially. He was heading to the front with this small corps of men, of which Yasuke was one, around 30 people. And one of his generals, basically, we still don't know to this day why, he brought his whole army of 13,000 and attacked. They were all gunned down, essentially. Nobunaga, with Yasuke and his lover Ranmaru, come into the middle of the temple where their last moments are held. The temple is on fire around them. And nobody really is going to know what happened in that room because there's only 3 people and they all died, except for Yasuke. But we only know that Yasuke survived because the Jesuits recorded it as such. We don't know what he saw, unfortunately. The normal legend goes, Nobunaga cut his belly, Ranmaru took his head off as his second, and then one supposes that Ranmaru then cut his belly and Yasuke took off Ranmaru's head. And the supposed last order is Yasuke save my head. Yasuke runs with the head to Nobunaga's son, who's probably about 5 to 10 minutes walk away, very close in a different temple, also about to be attacked, also just putting up the defenses for a last-ditch stand. Of course, that doesn't last very long. He's dead within the hour or so. And all we know from the Jesuit source, there are no more Japanese sources, all we know from the Jesuit source is that Yasuke was there at the last. He was one of the few survivors. He was taken prisoner. He surrendered his sword. And he was then escorted to the Jesuit mission, which was, again, only 5 minutes walk away. This is a very small area of Kyoto where all this happens. And the Jesuits give thanks to God for his deliverance. And sadly, that's the final word we have proven of Yasuke.
Oh, that's so frustrating. That must be really annoying for you.
It is. There's a lot of little politics in it. Why was he spared? Why didn't he die? You'll have to read the book if you want to find out the details about that. But essentially, he probably in offering to the Jesuits that the usurper Akechi Mitsuhide may have wanted to get the Jesuits on his side, etc. There are a lot of good reasons for that. So that's one possibility. We have no definite record of Yasuke after that. We have lots of records of other Africans, big Africans, very black-skinned Africans, Africans that can speak Japanese. But none of them we know for definite are Yasuke.
So frustratingly, after such a wonderful, glittering, short career, he then just vanishes from the record.
But this is an era, as you know, where people die young. And, it's conceivable that he would have been about 27, 28 at this point, maximum 29. He was before 30. But the average age of death among normal people was probably not much more than that. So you say a short life in our terms for today, but in those terms, it probably would have been a normal lifespan.
Given that Yasuke's career then is relatively short, so a few years towards the end of Nobunaga's life, how has he become such a part of popular culture in Japan? Does he have a legacy in Japan that lasts to today?
He does. He was forgotten for a very long time. There are Jesuit records of him repeated as they copied the letters into books and to new books up until about 1712, I think, 1709 is the last mention of him in a Jesuit account of the Japanese mission. Then he's basically forgotten about for 300 years after that. There's no mention of him whatsoever until the 1960s, when he suddenly appears in a Japanese historical fiction book. The reason for this is that the Jesuit records were translated into Japanese for the first time, essentially during World War II. The scholar that did it, trying to keep his head down and not get involved in all the politics going on, and he just carried on translating these records, and they were published after the war. So suddenly you've got all this rich history which has been lost for several hundred years just in the open. And copies of those Jesuit histories are in virtually every library. All I had to do was walk 2 minutes downstairs to my university library and get them out. And they were there, and that was the records of Yasuke. His story is revealed to the world, along with everything else in the Jesuit records, of course. And this lady writes this wonderful children's history, basically. It's called Kurosuke. Kurusu is her name, Yoshio Kurusu. And it's a very, very sympathetic story. It's at the same time as the civil rights movement's happening in the US, and there's a lot of input from that as well in the book as well. Then in the 70s, another very famous author, the same one who wrote Silence, which was made into a movie by Scorsese, Endo Shunsaku, also writes a book about him, which is not quite such a nice book about him. It is almost what we think of it as discriminatory these days. He does silly things. Anyway, then he's forgotten about again for another 20 years to the 1990s. From the 1990s onwards, he's in television dramas, he's in manga, he's in anime, he's in plays, and then he becomes more and more a main character, to the extent where you've got computer games like the one we're talking about here, where he's becoming a playable character, or he's becoming one of the main characters and the main attractions of these computer games and other things. I think, again, his time has come. Japan is now a very, very swiftly multiculturalizing society. From having very, very few people of foreign origin 20 or 30 years ago, triple, quadruple, the society is changing very, very quickly here. And Yasuke is a very positive symbol of a previous multicultural era when people were endeavoring to communicate and do things together here in Japan, but also around the world. He's seen as a symbol of this. And again, you said it, he came at the right time in Japan at that time. I think now his time in the modern world has come as well.
He sounds like someone who keeps appearing at the right moments and the right times. He appeared in Japan during his lifetime, but also his sort of afterlife. He appears, as you mentioned, with that children's book around the same time as American civil rights movement is going on. There's a story to be told there.
He was brought into service by the author to emphasize the power of Africans and to emphasize a positive story about Africans in the midst of this era.
Yeah, and then again now he can speak to Japan's previous endeavours with multiculturalism to inform where society is going now. So he seems like someone who is always there at the right time.
Lucky man.
Yeah, he did really, really well. What an absolutely fascinating life he lived. You can find out so much more about Yasuke in Thomas's fabulous book, African Samurai.
It's published in the UK as Yasuke, by the way, not African Samurai. That was the US edition. Whichever one you look at, it's still the same book. So I hope you enjoy it. And the new book as well, which is a different book. It's called Gentleman from Japan. It says Reverse Yasuke, about a Japanese man that goes to Britain and meets Queen Elizabeth I.
Well, thank you so much for joining us, Thomas. It's been an absolute pleasure to talk to you and to find out more about Yasuke and his career and his afterlife, indeed.
Thank you very much for having me. It's been an honour.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Echoes of History, a Ubisoft podcast brought to you by History Hit. Next time, we'll be discovering more about one of the most significant figures in Japanese history. You've heard his name, but we're going to take a much closer look at Oda Nobunaga. So join us for the next episode to find out more about the history behind the world of Assassin's Creed.